Hollywood is an interesting beast when it comes to degrees of impact on culture. It helps shape it while also reflecting it back to us. Sometimes true works of art are produced and it has people saying, yeah. Not just films and television, but entertainment in general can keep life interesting and be there for us when we're at our most bleak.
What's the most inspiring thing you ever heard?
You know, Gucci Mane once said, "It's like I live in a toilet, the way that I be shitting." I think that's a very profound statement.
But like most art, what once was a bastion of creativity has turned into a conveyor belt. A well-oiled machine designed with the sole purpose of churning out the perfect cookie-cutter product. And worse yet, those products are being pushed into people's faces by virtue-signaling cringe lords. Gone with the Wind is the highest-grossing movie of all time adjusted for inflation, and that came out almost 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, the movie theater didn't have television, video games, TikTok, podcasts, and YouTube to compete with. Hollywood adjusted with the times, creating things with more and more spectacle, and filmmaking improved almost exponentially over the 20th century. But the industry finds itself in quite the predicament in modern times. Napoleon, for example, a niche R-rated historical drama with a $200 million price tag, released in theaters with the understanding by Apple Studios that it would most certainly lose money. But that's the point. It's in theaters to draw people to Apple's streaming platform when it moves there shortly. We've reached critical mass. The pandemic took quite a toll on Hollywood, and their plans to dive into streaming went into overdrive. It was a perfect storm of events when mixed with Hollywood's treatment of the movie theater industry, leaving major movie studios little in the way of good news the past few years. 3 years after the pandemic, and the worldwide box office is still at figures not seen since the early 2000s, which is even worse when you keep in mind that budgets have skyrocketed along with ticket prices, meaning films cost more than ever to make. The industry's bringing in its worst dollar figures since 2003, and less people are going to the theater. Domestically, the theatrical movie-going industry has shed over 3,000 screens since 2020. This problem is Shrek. It's like an onion. There are layers to this shit. We can't go over everything in one go. So this is kind of a new video series, and we're taking a look at why the movie industry is pissing itself lately, starting specifically with the death of the Hollywood blockbuster. Have you ever Googled yourself and were shocked to find your personal information on one of those public listing sites? Yeah, me too. Googling my name, I can find my previous addresses, workplaces. It's creepy and feels incredibly intrusive. Data brokers are making a fortune selling our information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about us, like where we live. That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do, and Aura will handle it for you. You can try Aura free for 2 weeks using my link, and Aura does so much more to protect you from online threats you can't see. It's really easy to set up, so you don't have to download several different apps to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. You get everything at one affordable price. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online so you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. You can let people continue to exploit and profit off your private info, or you can go to my link right here to start your 2-week free trial. Also linked in the description. So why is the blockbuster dying? First things first, movie studios sabotaging their own partners, the theaters. Movie theaters are entirely dependent on movie studios in order to generate profit. A massive portion of revenue is generated from concessions, which is only possible because of the demand for the films at the cinema, which, as you well know, has diminished considerably over the last couple of years. It has slowly rebounded since the pandemic when absolutely no theaters were open, but it already seems like a lifetime ago when Avengers Endgame shattered records with a $350 million domestic opening. In 4 years, the theatrical landscape has changed dramatically, from thriving to what feels like a barren wasteland. I personally love the theatrical experience. I go to the cinema multiple times a month, but besides a few films a year, the theater is usually empty. Just a few years ago, massive crowds for movies were the norm every weekend. But now a billion-dollar movie is the outlier instead of feeling like something that happens nearly a dozen times a year. In 2019, there were 9 movies that made over $1 billion. In 2023, with 1 month to go, there have only been 2, Barbie and the Super Mario Bros. Movie. In 2019, there were 75 movies that grossed over $100 million worldwide. In 2023, there have been 41. I couldn't find any exact figures for this year, but here's something interesting. Continuing the comparison, in 2019, the average budget for the top 20 films of the year was $140 million. And remember that 9 of those grossed over $1 billion. This year, 2023, 14 films had budgets over $200 million, and only one of them is guaranteed to turn a profit, with most struggling to simply break even. That's insane. If this was a person, it'd deserve a Dana White reaction.
Fuck that guy. Fuck that guy.
And that's just the topic of theatrical releases. The other half of this conversation is the amount of money streaming services are spending on shit nobody is watching. So how'd all this happen to the theatrical experience? We can boil it down to the obvious, but a little more detail reveals the tale of how studios engage in self-sabotage. It's greed in their approach to the theatrical window and what happens to expensive movies when nobody watches them. By the 50s and 60s, Hollywood was booming, but the modern summer blockbuster wouldn't come around until arguably Jaws in the summer of 1975. The film checked all the boxes for a now typical blockbuster, with the effects on screen blowing people away and the thrilling story capturing the imagination of audiences. So became the trend of making films full of spectacle meant for a mass audience. This is when the idea of the summer blockbuster was just getting rolling, and there was nothing streamlined or assembly line cliches to release yet. Creativity was flourishing, and fresh original ideas were making their way on screen because there was no roadmap yet or how-to on how to make a blockbuster hit movie, at least not at the scale we would soon see. From the mid-70s onward, we'd get masterpieces like Alien, Aliens, Star Wars, Predator, Jurassic Park, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Batman. I could name films for the next 5 to 10 minutes and I'd still be leaving off hit movies. But since Jaws, the way the box office functions has changed over time too. Some of it is due to viewer habits, some of it's due to studio manipulation and sales tactics. And no matter what part we discuss, it only takes a glance to see the box office landscape of the late 70s looks nothing like the 90s, the mid-2000s, or present day. In the earlier years of summer movies, films would start slower with smaller releases that would expand over weeks. Films that would wind up with mammoth final tallies, 70 million, 100 million, 200 million, pedestrian numbers by the standards of the last 15 years, but big numbers then. These films would reach those totals over months and sometimes even a full year of being in theaters. Contrast that with the current pinnacle of modern blockbuster in Avengers Endgame, where its opening weekend alone was over $350 million. A completely different world. Over the decades, the summer blockbuster became tentpole releases for studios. Things were still evolving, filmmaking was rapidly changing, and Hollywood was figuring out how to market and sell these films instead of using their quality to build momentum. Once they could be marketed, a formula was created, something everyone can follow. And you started seeing studios stake out claims for opening weekends a year or sometimes years in advance. Opening weekend grosses started becoming headlines. Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. These are a few examples that had their box office talked about as much as their quality. The more the summer calendar filled up, the stiffer the competition became. And even through the 90s, Hollywood was still in the process of perfecting the art of the summer blockbuster. Production budgets began to rise. A $100 million budget was crazy talk when Terminator 2 came out in 1990, but it started to become a bit more normalized by the time 2002's Spider-Man hit theaters. You can see how it escalates pretty quickly to the wild budgets of modern-day blockbusters that average about $200 million a piece now. And Western culture functions on disposable products. It's consumerism, baby, yeah. Or corporatism, pick your ism. We're a society that's totally fine with companies creating products with planned obsolescence. The new iPhone, the new whatever, the next disposable meal at McDonald's. As American culture matured into what it's become today, companies became better at manufacturing and selling their disposable products. Same with Hollywood. It's not to say that every movie back in the day was a masterpiece and everything now is shit, but more film and television shows are in production now than in the 70s, 80s, and 90s by a magnitude of a fucking lot. A gazillion, it seems. So that means now for every one good movie, there's like 30 shitty ones. As time goes on, with every weekend on the summer calendar accounted for further and further in advance, Hollywood capitalized on consumerism. The opening weekend became important practically and as a marketing tactic. Each film had one weekend to make as big of a splash as possible before the next new greatest movie ever would come out. So the studios hyped up and emphasized opening weekend figures that would grab headlines and help a film seem like a big deal. Because a big number means people are seeing it, and that must mean it's good, right? FOMO sets in and human psychology takes over. Hollywood was fine-tuning this money-generating machine while the world is shifting to the internet, with YouTube and Netflix revolutionizing media distribution for the digital age. The success of Netflix brought in billions of dollars from investors, and they funneled that into original programming that was not only well received, but people actually watched it. While every media distribution company under the sun would convince some sucker investor to fund their own streaming platform, Hollywood was busy perfecting the summer movie season. You know why concessions are so expensive at movie theaters? Besides the fact that everything is too fucking expensive, it's because movie studios take a massive cut of ticket prices. Depending on the studio, a deal could be cut where they take almost the entire face value of the ticket for the first 2 weekends of a film, and then their percentage goes down each week from there. So by that point, there's every incentive possible to milk a movie for opening weekend. The accolades, the free marketing, and the fact that it's the studio's opportunity to make the most money possible as quickly as possible. The exhibitors left hanging when the rush for that movie is over and they collect 75% of the ticket price once week 5 rolls around and 2 people show up for the Friday evening show. So when you wonder why concessions are so expensive, you can thank Disney. With the rise of social media and content creation, podcasting, and everything in between over the past 20 years, and the ever-expanding popularity of sports, esports, and any other distraction under the sun, competition for people's attention has never been higher. So it's impressive to note that while ticket sales per movie were in sharp contrast to the insane levels something like Gone with the Wind sold in the early 1900s, adjusted for inflation, the movie industry had made more and more money each year with minimal bumps for decades. That is, until the pandemic. With nearly every theater across the world shut down, studios fast-tracked their streaming platforms with new ones popping up seemingly overnight. Theater was dead and never coming back according to analysts, and the studios could finally go the route of brick-and-mortar stores and cut out the middleman like Amazon did, and go direct to consumer on a streaming platform they owned. With fresh money printed around the globe, cash was flowing everywhere, and investors dumped billions into this shit. Netflix, Disney+, Paramount+, Peacock, Apple TV, all the fucking Infinity Stones were present. Television production budgets had been increasing for years, but now they were on par with the summer blockbuster films that were in theaters just a couple years prior. Warner Brothers shit its collective company bottoms when they tried to have it both ways and announced their 2021 slate of films would be released simultaneously in theaters and on their streaming service HBO Max, pissing off a number of prominent names in the industry. The MCU had been the most dominant force in cinema history up to that point, and there had been plenty of chatter about how Disney and Marvel had done a major disservice to the theater industry, turning audiences towards spectacle and away from giving smaller movies any chance in cinemas. The decline of the modestly budgeted, non-action adventure-oriented film was obvious before the pandemic, but once the dust settled, it was painfully clear Hollywood had contributed to its own demise in a major way. Maybe this would all be fine if people were still seeing the major blockbusters, but they weren't. Not only because theaters were far less convenient than a television at home, but because the movies in the theater were mostly bad. The quality of the product in the theater was shit, contributing to some of the biggest flops in history. The Marvels has flopped in dramatic fashion and showed Disney that at this point, the MCU is seen as one collective IP, not a collection of individual ones like it felt like before. Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor each had their own separate franchise, and the Avengers was its own too. Fast forward to Phase 5, and yeah, technically speaking, there are separate franchises, but people don't give a fuck about these characters, and they all kind of exist in a vacuum now. So when Doctor Strange 2 sucks, then Thor 4 sucks, then Black Panther sucks, then Ant-Man 3 sucks, it means less people are going to see the Marvels because they aren't seeing it as its own entity separate from all the piles of shit I just mentioned. And what happens when no one goes to the movies for big blockbusters? And the studios lose millions of dollars because they're accustomed to blowing government-level fortunes on movie budgets. And they didn't make smaller films to bridge the financial gap between big films in case they bombed. And all those movies that went to streaming don't get watched because there's way too much content. What happens then? First, theaters close. Streaming services will go down, but maybe that's a good thing. There's way too fucking many. And studios already accustomed to taking very little chance with their IPs and playing it safe are going to play it even safer. Fear of a collapsing industry. Fear and pressure can drive people to do great things. But this is modern Hollywood we're talking about here. So far, I've seen fear responsible for making studios follow what they think is the most sanitized route possible in order to earn as much as possible while being as safe as possible. There is hope, though, and it's not coming from the industry giants that brought so much joy but have become the architects of their own demise. It comes from the most obvious source: independent filmmakers and studios. The giants in the industry used to be the same as those small independent films of 2023. I once compared the movie industry to a musician in his or her twilight years of their career. When they were younger, they were learning and soaking everything in, and everything was fresh, and they were more willing to take risks with their work and try new things. As they got successful, they found what works and got into a groove, and fall way past their creative prime. Then the stuff they make might become overproduced, too sanitized, too obvious. That describes the path of the movie industry. Once young guns, the future of cinema lies in the hands of young guns again. A24 is the trendy studio to point out as the one that understands this, but that's for a reason. They've put out consistently high-quality films at budgets that are next to nothing, and they offer no compromise. The films are, generally speaking, stunning, with stories above and beyond other movies in the same theater from studio behemoths that spent 100 times the money to make a film 100 times inferior. In July of this year, I enjoyed Oppenheimer. Yeah, Barbie wasn't for me. But I was really happy to see both films doing so well, especially since they unnecessarily opened at the same time. Although I heard Nolan refused to move Oppenheimer to say fuck you to Warner Brothers, which I definitely respect. I thought both of those movies doing so well was great for movie theaters, which it is. But studios would need to take some lessons from their success, and I fear they're going to take some wrong ones too. One thing they'll definitely take away: spend less money on these movies. Barbie and Oppenheimer were reasonably priced compared to other modern big-budget movies, and there's no reason for films to cost as much as these studios are spending. It's wild to see Ant-Man 3 look like shit, but a film like Talk to Me from A24 cost a penny and a donut to make and looks absolutely beautiful. And a bad thing they'll take away? Thinking people want more IPs. That's the most frustrating part. I don't think studios will learn from Barbie and Oppenheimer that people will go to the theater if you give them great movies with characters people like and care about. The movies that have made $1 billion post-pandemic aren't surprising after you watch them. Even if they're not your cup of tea, they do things a lot of other movies don't. Entertain a lot of people. GG's.